Today I am doing a bit of a more abstract discussion, and the topic of today's discussion is going to be how often should you buy from the Riverfolk Company. But I'm not doing this alone. I'm joined by a very special guest today, Elivaras. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Great to have you on the channel. You're the first guest to appear, so congratulations, I guess. It'll be a fun time.
I am very honored and very happy to be with you and collaborating on this video. Very excited.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. So I just thought I'd run through a bit of your qualifications, I guess, on this otter topic, since I'm a big fan of the otters, but I wouldn't consider myself a great player of them. But you, I absolutely would. So just for the viewers at home, I'm going to run through a few points here. Elivaras is currently playing in the 2022 Winter Tournament, and he is a semifinalist. The semifinals are about to start, I believe. So hopefully he'll end up winning the whole thing. But just making the semifinals is a huge accomplishment. The winter tournament sees some of the highest levels of root play that we currently have. In addition, I would consider him the foremost authority on the Riverfolk Company. Would you consider yourself an otter main?
I would. Um, Foremost authority, high praise for sure. There's some areas I think I'm still lacking a little bit of experience in, specifically with just playing up against the Marauder factions more often. But I would consider myself a main. I still do try and play the other factions, obviously, because it's very important, if not even more important sometimes, to understand the other factions as well as your own faction. But overall, Otters I enjoy the most, and I tend to put more thought into playing the Otters than I do other factions.
Right, for sure. That's awesome. And then you are also a root tuber. You've recently started making root content. Specifically, I wanted to shout out a video you made a couple weeks ago about how you actually earned the first Riverfolk Company win of the 2022 Winter Tournament. I'll put a link to that up in the corner of the video. I think that's how this works. But yeah, you won and it wasn't like early in the tournament. It was in round two, so pretty big deal.
Yeah, the Otters have definitely been struggling in the tournament. And I kind of had a feeling going into my game. I think it was round two, winners bracket game two that I went into. I kind of had a feeling going into my game that I'd probably end up with the Otters, forced into a position where I could pick them, and it would kind of be a swing for the fences. Managed to pull it out, and as Cole said, I have a video breaking that on breaking down the entire game. It's quite long, but it's filled with a lot of analysis. And after that video, now we're working on a complete Otters guide. So that'll come at some point in the future when it's done. But yeah, first Otters win in the tournament. We've seen a few more since then. There's been a lot of very interesting situations surrounding each Otters win. In my game in particular, very racy, um, pretty tough game, I would say. Some games, a little bit easier with the Otters with five players and so on, but overall, they're not the easiest faction to work with, and it was pretty cool to be able to bring home the first win for them.
Yeah, that's great. And I know I'm definitely looking forward to that Otter comprehensive strategy guide. That first video that you put out had all sorts of useful ways of thinking about the Otters that I hadn't really considered before. So I definitely do recommend the viewer, go ahead and watch that video after this one. Uh, Elivaris is going to be putting out just the best Riverfolk content on YouTube, because there's not a ton out there right now, and I think it's great that you're doing that. So,
Yeah, thank you very much. I definitely agree. There is not enough, and I can't wait to be able to contribute to that pool with hopefully some good up-to-date content.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So you did touch on this a bit, but the reason we're having this video, we're talking about this today, is the Riverfolk Company is struggling. And so I just wanted to briefly touch on why that is, sort of set the stage for why we're talking about how often you should be purchasing from the Riverfolk Company. The first reason they're struggling is because of advanced setup. So, advanced setup causes players to have less of a need to purchase cards early in the game from the Riverfolk. And that's because In advanced setup, you have the ability to draft your hand of 3 cards from 5 that you're dealt. So a lot of times players would purchase early on in the game from the Otters in order to quote unquote fix their hand. We don't really see that as much anymore with advanced setup. Another point would be the new Marauder factions. And I would say I'm not actually very experienced yet playing with these factions, or not as much as I would like to be, because I don't play on Tabletop Simulator very much. I only play digital and in person. Rats and Badgers, as we know, they have many battle actions available to them, and that makes otter policing on their part pretty easy. Is there anything else specific about the Marauder factions that you think has contributed to Riverfolk's struggling, or is it just the available battle actions?
I don't know. It's kind of tough. The available battle actions make these factions in particular very devastating to the Otters. But one of the big things I think with their introduction is they are both militant factions. So you see more militant factions with stronger battle actions on the board more often. Pre-Marauder, really the only faction that could easily challenge the Riverfolk was the Erie, specifically with the God of War strategy, where they go charismatic and they go no turmoil. But now you have both the Erie and the Badgers, and then or both the Erie and the Rats, and sometimes the Badgers as well can now police them pretty effectively. So there's just a lot more threats to you in more drafts more often.
Yeah, certainly. So these 2 points are just sort of facts of the meta right now, where it currently stands. But there is a third point of this triangle of Riverfolk struggle, and that's the one that we're going to really try and address today. And that is the pre-Marauder mindset. So many players still treat the Riverfolk as being as strong as they were in the Underworld meta. Now, neither of us, I believe, were really into competitive route during the Underworld meta, but from what we've gathered and watching older tournament games and listening to strategy discussion or reading up on strategy discussion from back in the day, the Riverfolk were a very dominant faction, and this is very clear when you look at the winter tournament statistics. So in the 2020 winter tournament, the Otters had a win rate of 46%. And then going into the 2021 winter tournament, the Marauder factions were introduced for the first time, and their tournament win rate dropped to 16%, which is just, I think that might be the sharpest decline any faction has had ever in tournament win rate. I have no way of fact checking that right now, but it is really steep. I'd have a hard time believing any other faction went under such a hard drop off. And this year they've rebounded a bit. So far in the tournament, they have a 26% win rate, but it is still a far cry from where they used to be.
Yeah, they've very much been struggling recently. I think the Riverfolk are still in an interesting spot because the win rate doesn't always completely portray how dominant they are or not dominant. 46 to 16, I think, is pretty obvious just to show in general, like a decline that sharp has to be for a good reason. 26% um, is a decent win rate. It's obviously not amazing, and it's not up there with some of the best factions. However, the Riverfolk are also one of the swingiest factions when it comes to whether they win a game or not, and it can widely depend on um, the the factions at the table and the people and how they behave. So is not a statement about like right now is not a statement about how the Otters are just people are learning to play them better. The meta's rebalancing. I think a bunch of these wins, or some of these Otters wins, were due to some poor decisions at the table sometimes, where the Otters were taking some inefficient actions on their turns that could or should have cost them the game, but it didn't. There's also been a lot more 5-player games as of late, and Otters do a lot better in 5-player than 4-player. So I think there's still some compounding factors there, and it's not just like, oh yeah, everyone's doing better with them now. That's why it's at 26%. I think you still have to take the supposed rise with a grain of salt. It's certainly not scientific evidence. None of these tournament tournament statistics are particularly scientific evidence or very statistically significant, other than the absolutely massive decline after the release of Marauder.
Yeah, I just wanted to include that 2022 win rate, just so it didn't seem like we were cherry picking data. That is a very big drop off from 2020 to 2021, and like you said, there are many factors that account for a faction's win rate, and even beyond that, like the winter tournament itself is a pretty small sample size when you look in comparison to all the root games being played. And then the 2022 tournament in particular is even smaller because it hasn't finished yet. I believe there have only been 19 Otter games or something like that, of which they've won 5. So, yeah, it's certainly not definitive, but it does just give you an idea of, like, it's quantifiable that there has been a drop off in Otter success since the release of the Marauder expansion. And that's all that we really wanted to establish here. And
Yeah,
so
100%.
yeah, and so now that we have established that, we can go ahead and start talking about why you and I should buy from the Otters. Because it's important to note that there needs to be a reason for us to purchase from the Otters, right? We're not just going to purchase from them because we feel bad that they're doing poorly. That's not what this video is about. This video is about the fact that there are opportunities with the Otters that players are not taking because they're being held back by that mindset of Otters being really strong and that you shouldn't purchase from them very often. So we can go ahead and talk about the first point of why you should buy from Otters, and that's to level out the playing field. The first reason you would need to level out the playing field is the fact that some factions really do need the help. Talking about your lizards, talking about your cats, factions that can gain a lot of benefit from purchasing a card from the Otters, and that card is really necessary to keep them going, right? The cats need those bird cards, the lizards need those cards to score or in the early game to establish presence and gardens with. This is the same reason why when players say, if you buy, I'll have to buy two, as a way of de-incentivizing you to purchase from the Otters, that's the reason why this doesn't really hold up, because maybe they're playing God of War Eerie. Well, they certainly don't need a purchase from the Otters. Neither do the Moles. You know, those strong factions don't have the same need of purchasing from the Otters that a weaker faction might.
That is absolutely true. And not to discredit anyone who would purchase as, like, let's say, the God of War or the Moles, as there are scenarios where they do really want to buy. But again, if you buy, I'll have to buy two. I have heard that touted by some very experienced players. And it's really just, in my opinion, it's just complete BS. It's all table talk. I'm just saying, I know that if you buy, you're going to get stronger, and I don't want you to be stronger. So I'm going to give you some argument that's going to tell you not to buy, so that neither you nor the Riverfolk get stronger and can challenge my leading position. It really all does come down to the table state. Some factions do need it a lot more than others, and so you shouldn't. And I mean, the reality of the situation is every faction is not on a level playing field, and suddenly one faction isn't now there ahead of everyone else, and everyone suddenly needs to catch up because they bought one card. That is often not the situation, and there's a lot of nuance.
So, moving on to our next point, some players have been policed into a worse position than others. This is just the nature of the game, right? Sometimes you take a really hard hit, sometimes the board overcorrects, and now you're in a really bad position. So, just going back to that first point, is another reason why saying if you buy, I'll have to buy two doesn't hold up, right? If you determine that you need to make a purchase because of your position, don't let another player dissuade you from making that purchase on the basis of if you buy, I'll have to buy two.
Yeah, definitely. And touching on that just a little bit more, the reality is they don't have to buy. No one has to do anything. It's just a threat to dissuade you from making yourself stronger and from making the Otters stronger, because they see their chances lower a little bit if you buy and you get stronger and the Otters get stronger. So no, they don't have to. They're not forced to. There's no one, sitting there telling them, if you don't buy right now, like, the game's going to end and it's game over.
And so, as one final point here, Otters can use those funds that you purchase with to police the leader for you. And this is always good because there's a concept in root of you don't want to police from last place, right? You don't want to police from behind. Policing falls on the job of the player in second place, right? Because they're the one who stands to gain the most from the leader taking a hit. So if you're the player in fourth place and you're buying because you need the help, well, the double benefit of that is you've just helped the Otters now police the leader. There is that other scenario of what if the Otters are the leader? And that's probably a situation where you don't want to buy from them, but we'll touch on that later. Otters need a win condition. Root is a self balanced game, like Ellie was just mentioning a bit ago. And if one player determines that they have no chance to win, you cannot rely on them to make rational decisions. This comes up a lot when discussing keep rushing. If the Cats get their keep destroyed early in the game, they might determine that they can't win this game. And so the only way they have any form of agency left is to attack the player who put them in this position. It's more of a unclear topic with the Otters, right? Because if they don't get purchases, it's not like on one player, but they are certainly going to be unresponsive to players asking them to do things for the good of the table when they've been put in a position by the table where they can't win.
This is something I see come up a lot when tables talk about, oh, well, the solution to the Otters is just the whole table agrees not to buy. We just act as if the Otters aren't in the game. And this is a very dangerous mindset because people think about it and they say, oh, well, isn't it good that we take one faction out of the game completely, that they don't have a chance? That's great. Yeah, I mean, that can be good for you. However, as we mentioned earlier, buying from the Otters can put you in the position you need to be in to balance the table, right? It prevents a runaway. It helps Otters really help prevent runaway leaders because they can be very easily used to kind of clean up the game state and make everything closer. And then if no one buys, not only do you have that situation where it's harder to balance the game, and if there's a runaway leader, it's going to be harder to stop them. But also, as Cole just mentioned, the Otters player does not under any obligation to help the table. There's no reason really for them to make rational decisions when they clearly don't have a chance. Whenever someone is knocked out of the game, they kind of get to choose what they want to do. Do they want to king make someone? Do they want to domino police? The likelihood that someone performs a form of domino policing when they are in last place and the whole table's decided to ignore them is very, very slim. And so you should not expect that, an Otters player that you have deliberately starved out of the game want to help you in any way and is very likely to not be receptive to your requests.
It's worth noting that, like, if you are that player who's in the runaway position, that's when no purchases benefits you. And it's just a good idea in general when someone is putting an idea out there about something like this, about a table behavior or about an action that a specific player should take. You want to consider what their motivation is for making that statement, right? So if the player saying no one should buy from the Otters is the player in the lead, well, then maybe you should re-examine that through your own lens rather than just taking what they say at face value.
Very important to consider.
And then I just have a little way of thinking that I like to have about Otter purchases here at the end. If neither you nor the Otters won the game when you're looking back at it, you probably could have made another purchase. And so, like, as you play more games with the Otters, you're going to get a better sense of what constitutes overfeeding and what constitutes starving or underfeeding them. And, in concert with these tips and discussion points that we have, that experience is going to help you determine when you can make those purchases and get away with it and still win the game. Finally, do not enable extortion Otters. Ellie, could you explain what extortion Otters are?
Yeah, so extortion Otters are a specific play style of Otters where they will deliberately extort another faction to force the faction to purchase. It is typically a much meaner play style than standard Otters play, where they will do things like camp on the sawmills of the Marquis and demand that the Marquis either buy mercenaries so that they have rule, or buy a card to get them to move off. Where they might threaten a keep rush because they're right there, on the river, and if they place their keep on the river, that's a possibility. Where they might deliberately sit in clearings that the lizards want to build gardens in to force mercenary purchases. Sometimes that can be a strat to slow people down, but Like sometimes these can be strats to slow a winning faction down, but when you're on turn two doing this just to force them to buy mercenaries, that typically makes people very upset with you. And there is a kind of running philosophy around how you deal with play styles like this, and it can be summed up quite easily. And it says, "Do not negotiate with terrorists." So if someone is deliberately trying to force you to purchase with threats of basically wiping you off the map or completely forcing you out of the game, you do not give in to those threats. The reality for someone like Katz is that if the Otters is camping on your sawmill and you're forced to buy mercenaries every turn so that you can use it, the Otters are going to win. Even if you do that, you do not have a chance if the Otters consistently do that. And by giving into that, you are telling the Otters this works and you should do it more. As a community, especially in high level play, the way players respond to it is just going in saying, you know what, I'm not going to win the game anyways. I'm just going to smack the crap out of the Otters and teach them that this isn't the way to play. And so as a result, I would not recommend anyone to be using this play style when going through the Otters. And when we talk about when you should buy from them throughout the rest of this video, keep this in mind. Do not buy from extortion Otters pretty much ever. Do not enable this play style.
Absolutely. We don't want to set the precedent that extortion otters can win games, because not only is it bad for the player buying, it's a bad experience for everyone at the table as well. Like, we're all humans with emotions, and no one likes to feel like they're being taken advantage of throughout the course of a game. All right, so we're going to move on here to this phrase that I hear parroted a lot amongst all root players, even top level ones, of two purchases gives the Otters the game. So, what do they mean by that? They mean that in a game where one player makes one purchase from the Otters, and then on another turn, another player makes one purchase from the Otters, the game's as good as over. The Otters have already won. So, as a table, you need to avoid doing that. But we want to push back on that point and just do a bit of simple math and try and make it clear that that's not the case anymore. If it ever even was the case to begin with, it's certainly not the case in the Marauder meta. We can start off here. Starved Otters. Starved Otters assumes that no one purchases from the Otters. So throughout the course of a game, they will accrue 17 funds of their own Otter meeples. How do we get to that number? We have to assume that it's an 8-turn game. That's an average game of Root. So 17 comes from the 3 funds they start with in the payments box, plus 2 from protectionism on each subsequent turn. That's 14 total, plus the 3 get us 17. Other assumptions we have to make in this scenario are that the Otters never get attacked, and that the Otters have no issues placing their trade posts. So basically we're describing an ideal game in which the table starves the Otters. And just doing some quick math, we need 2 funds to place a trade post. There are 9 trade posts. That's 18 funds. So if the Otters are starved, we don't even get enough funds to place all 9 trade posts. So on top of all of the assumptions above, winning this game is going to require great RNG with our card drawing. So it's pretty safe to say starving the Otters basically locks them out of the game. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that statement. Starved Otters don't really have a chance. The only time they do is when they're, as aforementioned, their card RNG is extremely good when other factions aren't crafting everything. And specifically, if the game ends up drawing out, going really long, if factions are heavily battling each other and policing each other, that's really the only scenario where Otters even have a chance. But realistically, in the majority of situations, Otters with only 17 funds over the course of the game are not going to have enough actions to meaningfully impact the table and do what they want to do. I like one little kind of rule of thumb I like to use sometimes when I play the Otters, I guess most times when I play the Otters, is by the mid to late game, you want to be at about 7 to 10 funds. That's like a comfortable spot. And how do you get there? Because you start with 3, and you have to place trade post, get extra Otters and craft. And if you, for example, on your second turn, you have 5 funds, if you trade post immediately, you're back to 3. And then if the next turn you trade post, you're back to 3. You're just constantly back to 3. And the way you get up to that 7 to 10 is by using two of your turns out of those 8 involve you spending 0 funds. That's a good way to get up to 7. But even then, that's four funds you're not using to trade post. You capping out at seven actions is still very, very limited amount for the course of the entire game. And it just really prevents you from meaningfully impacting the table.
And so we want to compare this Starved Otters scenario with the purchase scenario where two purchases happen. And this supposedly gives the Otters the game, right? The Otters will win the game on the back of two purchases. So with two purchases, they'll have 19 funds over the course of that same 18 turn game. Or not 18, gosh, that same 8 turn game. They'll have 19 funds. That'll be a mix of their funds and probably two other factions, maybe the same faction purchased twice, but we'll say it's one purchase from two different factions. We can assume everything that we assumed in the previous scenario, and additionally that these purchases are made on separate turns, notably not the first turn because that would give them a lot of surplus funds, and that each of these purchases are made for 3 funds. So they get an additional fund on 2 of their turns, and they end up with 19. So all this really does is make placing, first of all, it makes placing that 9th trade post possible to begin with, and it makes placing a couple of them easier than before. But the important thing here is that finding 12 additional points in the Marauder meta is still quite difficult. So those 2 additional funds really don't add up to all that much in terms of actually finding the win. They might end us up with a higher score, but saying that it's a solved, as soon as the Otters get 2 purchases, they will win the game, I think is just completely untrue in the current state of Root. Because even if we're never attacked, we can still lose warriors when picking off cardboard. And if we don't draw those craftables we need to win the game with to make up that point differential, the need for cardboard points and therefore the risk of losing warriors in battles is going to increase. The Otters are very fragile, right? We can only get warriors in this like very limited fund scenario by trade posting. We can't afford to spend any funds to recruit. And so losing any warriors is going to set us back majorly.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Realistically, when you're looking at, the numbers, two additional funds over the course of the game is not a lot. And with the amount of policing that the Otters can come under sometimes, and even in the ideal situation where they don't get policed, they might have a lot of pressure. You might have factions racing. The reality is that Otters do not race very well. They do best in entangled games, and if you get a faction like the Badgers in the game, they can race very well under the right situation. And if you don't have the funds to stop them, it can be hard. It's just like it's an increase, and games can certainly be won with just two purchases giving you two surplus funds. But it really still does require some fantastic RNG and you not being forced to spend your funds in any way other than trade posting.
So I think the conclusion here is that in the majority of scenarios, two purchases gives the Otters the game just isn't true. It can happen, but it's not a foregone conclusion by any means. And so moving on to the next slide here, we're going to discuss how often should you and I buy from the Otters. The first thing we need to do is be capable of analyzing the board state. You can ask yourself, what will my purchase allow the Otters to do? And a lot of that comes down to their ability to place trade posts. Next, you can ask how many surplus funds are they getting? So a surplus fund is any fund that takes them over the 2 funds they would receive from protectionism if no one purchases between their turns. Any surplus funds they get, each one of those will give them an additional action for the rest of the game, assuming they don't spend them before then. Next, we can ask, are my faction's funds useful for the Otters? And this is relevant because when you place trade posts, you need to spend a pair of funds matching the clearing's ruler in which you want to place that trade post. So if, say for example, you have 4 Corvid funds, but the Corvids only rule 1 clearing, it's essentially as if you only had 2 Corvid funds for the purposes of placing trade posts, which can be a pretty big consideration to make when deciding whether or not you should make a purchase. And one final question you can ask, how likely are my opponents to buy on the same turn? If more than one player purchases on the same turn, that is guaranteed surplus funds. It is, because prices are pretty much always set to 2 in what we'll call good Otters play, that's at least 2 surplus funds. And so you need to be able to determine, okay, do those 2 surplus funds make a big difference, or is it not really that big of a deal? And that all comes back to analyzing the board state. And you can do that because trade post points can always be calculated. You can always know how many points the Otters can score from placing trade posts on their turn, and you also know exactly what cards you have in their hand. So, or they have in their hand. So you know everything you need to calculate how many points the Otters can score, outside of what cards would they randomly draw on their turn. But outside of that, it's pretty much, besides the Corvids, the most transparent scoring of any faction in the game.
Yeah, they really are. It's not very difficult to calculate how many points the Otters can make on their turn if you just count, okay, where can they move, where can they trade post, what factions funds do they have, and can they instantly trade post with those funds, what trade posts they already placed. Yeah, it's not very difficult to figure out how many points the Otters can make. And unfortunately, we want to ask this question of how often should you buy. It's very rarely a questions like this very transparent. It's going to come down a lot of the time to experience, to knowing what position the Otters are in, to just have that experience with the game. So oh, hey, I remember that game where someone bought in this position and they won the game. So a lot of it is going to come down to skill with analyzing the current board state and deciding, okay, what does this purchase really allow the Otters to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And this video is not attempting to give you a roadmap of exactly when to purchase and for how much and on which turn, right? We are just trying to give you, the viewer, an idea of when purchasing is going to be A, good for you, and B, not too good for the Otters. And then C, we want you to take away that you can probably afford to purchase more from the Otters than you currently do, especially if you are following that rule of 2 purchases giving the Otters the game. Purchases are an easy way to prop up a threat to the leader without taking any actions, and I think that last point is the most important. Actions are king in Root. Every faction needs an action economy, and the ones with the better action economies often perform the best at a high level. And so, if you are able to create a problem for the game's leader without taking any actions yourself, that's incredibly valuable, and you should take advantage of it more often.
I think it's worth noting that this typically applies more to more experienced tables where players can properly analyze the board state, see who the threat is, and then police that threat. Root is definitely best when people are very aware and actively thinking about who the table leader is and how they can police them. And in maybe less experienced tables or players that are more vengeful or spiteful, you might end up in a situation where people are like, oh, well, you policed me, I'll police you, or you bought from the Otters, so now you have to deal with them. In experienced tables, that's not really how Root is played, and that isn't how Root should be played. It's hey, I'm in last place, I need a buy, and no, I can't afford to go deal with the Otters now. You got to deal with them because you're the one that has the most to lose. The reality is, Root is best when the entire table is trying to do everything they can to win and not making vengeful or spiteful plays. So if that is true, then propping up the Otters in your table can be very effective, a very effective way to force the table leader to deal with another threat and allow the Otters to become another threat on the table to challenge the table leader.
Yeah, because the more challengers there are to the throne, the more time that gives you to put yourself in a position to come in and snatch the win at the last minute. So, yes, definitely an experience table is an important component of this aspect of purchasing from the Otters, but maybe still try it and try and put that seed into your fellow players' minds, if it's a less experienced table, of exactly what Ellie just said, right? Even if they don't recognize it immediately themselves, you can still show it to them because Root is a lot of table talk, and you can be that person that talks and makes that threat apparent. Another reason people don't purchase from the Otters is that they're worried about not having their warriors returned. By putting the warriors on the Otters faction board, they are limiting their warrior supply further, and there are certain factions that are very concerned with their warrior count. So if you are worried about not having warriors returned, you can purchase on the condition that your funds get spent. As the buyer, you hold the power in the relationship, I would say, right? Because the Otters are reliant on you purchasing from them in order to feed their engine a little bit. And so if stipulating this condition or any other conditions that you want, such as policing the leader or anything like that, if making those stipulations gets the Otters a purchase that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten, and they believe that purchase is valuable to them, they will agree to your terms. And so you can set terms and negotiate with them as you see fit. Of course, deals are not binding, so they can break those deals, but they're not incentivized to do so because they want you to continually buy from them. They want your continued business.
So there are situations for the Otters where, they may be perfectly happy to break deals, but typically they don't want to do this early on in the game. So as Cole said, they do want continued business, but when you are playing as the Otters, you have to analyze at what point, do I think I'm going to be okay with the funds I have now? You don't want to, like, I don't think any Otters player or any player that's not the Otters should expect the Otters to agree to give their funds back every single turn if they're ever going to get a purchase. I think this is just very faction dependent is something to look at. If you're the Cats, you can probably afford to have 2 to 4, maybe even 5 cats locked up, depending on the game state. But if you're someone like the Corvids, 2 warriors, maybe max locked up is all you can really afford. And so if you're ever going to buy again, you need to give those funds back. So if you are the Otters player, you're playing against them and you're kind of thinking about, I can make this deal to give the funds back. Sometimes as the Otters, you are going to have to ask yourself, do I expect this faction to purchase again? Do I want to spend the 2 funds and just have them buy another card at 2? Does that really get me anything? Can I do something with that new trade post, or would I rather keep the card and have my own funds and keep their funds and put them in a slightly worse position? So definitely not a steadfast rule that every time you negotiate with the Otters, you should ask for your funds back. But as Cole said, it is important to sometimes put these stipulations on and not just buy willy-nilly expecting them to be returned, because there are many situations where the Otters don't want to return funds. And then as a result, you just say, okay, then I'm not going to buy. And they might decide to stick with that. They might decide not to. But then at that point, it's a decision for them and a decision for you. And it's not something you're blindsided by when you realize all of a sudden your funds aren't going to be returned.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the Otters don't agree to your stipulations, then it's fine. Just don't purchase. But also don't put yourself in the mindset of like, oh, well, they're not willing to work with me because they didn't agree to my stipulations, right? Come back to it next turn if you still want to make that purchase. Or immediately make a counteroffer, right? I don't want to just give you these funds with no strings attached. I want you to do something with them. Maybe you don't want them to return them right away. Maybe you want them to return them in a couple turns. Maybe you want them to use those funds to go police someone. Just keep those negotiations flowing, because the Otters are a valuable resource that you want to have available to you. You definitely don't want to lock yourself out of them just because of how you're approaching them being in the game. And the final time you should buy from the Otters is on your winning turn, or on a turn that you know will set you up for an unstoppable win. I think this is something that newer players might often overlook. The fact that it doesn't matter how many funds you give the Otters on this turn if you're going to win anyway. Or if there's no way they can come up with a win on their next turn and it puts you in a position where you will win. And to this end, we can consider leaving trade posts on the map so that we can make multiple purchases with them on our final turn in order to win the game. Because for each trade post on the map which we have a faction piece at, we can make one additional purchase from the Otters. Leaving trade posts on the map also has the additional benefit of making it harder for the Otters player to place more trade posts. If we continually remove those trade posts, it makes them have an easier time placing them in those clearings closest to them that they don't have much trouble reaching.
As Cole said, sometimes people will overlook just the ability that Otters bring for your game. When the Otters are in the game and as you play more with them, they add an additional kind of dimension to your game. You can't just consider, how do I win with my tools anymore? You also have to consider, how could I win with the Otters tools? There have been multiple games I have played where the Otters will, I've done this before, just how I've learned that, I might go smack some cat buildings to try and prevent them from winning. But oh no, actually, because I'm right next to them, they can actually just buy mercenaries and then get rule of the clearing and then just build in it without having to move. So, yes, I smack some buildings, but now they can just buy mercenaries without having to spend that move action. And maybe that enables them to build overwork build. Whereas I thought, they would need to just, move, then build overwork build. And they didn't have any bird cards. That was impossible. But now it is. And then the other dimensions of people can just buy cards out of your hand that really benefit them. Like we killed the lizards, huzzah! Like, they can't win anymore because they have one card in their hand. Oh wait, they can actually buy two or three times to get enough cards, and suddenly they can win. Or the moles, where they can buy in order to banker the cards. Or the cats, where you can buy bird cards to give you enough actions to win on your final turn, or maybe you could buy a craftable that allows you to win as any faction. There are a lot of ways that the otters can help you fulfill a win condition that you may not see if you're not used to kind of thinking in that way. So pay attention to that. And as Cole said, if you're on your final turn, you see an opportunity to win with the funds you have, or you buy it because it's your only shot to win. And if you don't take that shot, you're not going to win anyways. You might as well. Like, if you know it's going to be the last turn of the game, spend the funds, take the shot, unless, it's clearly not the final turn. If buying from the otters would make it the final turn, maybe don't consider it in that scenario, but really, really come to understand this additional dimension of winning when the otters are in play. And as the otters, you should be aware that people can win this way and try and mitigate that.
Yeah, and just to briefly add on to that, looking at this from the other side of things, something I discussed in my Riverfolk crafting guide is the value of having a Partisans card in the late game and just giving you the option of dumping most of the cards from your hand if you need to, because we know those cards can enable victories. And if we determine that they can because they're bird cards and the cats need them, or mole banker, or any of the other examples that Ellie listed, if we go in with a partisan and then are able to dump most of the cards from our hand, we can deny another faction a win that they might have had if we had kept those cards in our hand. So now we should talk about, what does a winning otters position look like? And there's no way to definitively say. Much like the rest of this guide, this is just to give you a baseline understanding of, like, what does it generally look like? What should you be looking for in order to determine if the otters are in a winning position? So the first thing that you're going to want to do is calculate how many points the otters can score from trade posts right now. On their turn, keeping in mind that they'll be getting 2 more funds via protectionism, how many points they can score if they drop everything and put trade posts down right now, because we're going to assume that on their winning turn, that's what they will be doing. So to do this, we'll count all foreign fund pairs, as well as nearby empty river clearings that they could get to in, say, one move, or that they're already currently occupying, that they will then be able to rule and spend their own warriors on a trade post in. Then, if that scoring puts them at a sizable lead, we can conclude they're in a winning position. Additionally, if that scoring puts them on equal footing, but they also have a good hand of craftables, we can still conclude that they're in a winning position.
All of these points are very important to consider when you're talking about the Otters game. As you learn when you play Root more, the score track as it currently stands is not a good delineator of who is winning and who's not winning. Now, there are scenarios where it does work out that way. Like, if someone is at 20 points and everyone else is at 10, yeah, they're probably winning. But when it comes to the Otters, when you're playing them and when you're playing against them, one of the things you want to get used to doing, as mentioned here, is just count up all of the funds and say, okay, how much can they get from trade posting right now? And then kind of assume that that is what their points are at. This gives you a much clearer picture of where they stand, because realistically, otters are generally somewhat sandbagging, not necessarily intentionally, um, but they're only at like 16 points. Oh wait, but they have like 10 funds worth of trade posts from other factions that they can use right now. Oh, maybe they're actually like way higher than that, and I should be concerned about them winning. There's a game I played recently where up until my like second last or last turn, I think it was second last turn, I got a ton of purchases. And one of the players I played with after the game was like, hey, I didn't actually realize how close you were to winning, that I could have actually gotten like 10 points worth of trade posts and then found the last like 2 points I needed to win. I could go from like 18 to 30. And sometimes people aren't aware of that, where they just assume, oh, they're at 18, they can't win. But you really do need to take into account how many funds they have, how much of those are easily trade postable, and then really add that to their score, their current score, to determine kind of what position they're in.
Next, we can think about when otters are keeping pace with the leader, accounting for trade post points. Just pretend there's a closing parenthesis there. I guess I forgot about it. Um, so they're keeping pace with the leader. Now we look at the amount of funds they have. If they have 6 or fewer funds, it's probably safe to say they're doing poorly, unless it's the very, very beginning of the game. But we're talking about mid to late game here when we're trying to calculate if they're in a winning position. We can't know if they're in a winning position early in the game anyway. If they have 7 to 10 funds, they're doing comfortably, like Ellie said earlier on. That's what a regular Otters mid to end game is going to look like. If they have 11 or more funds, you probably shouldn't be buying from them, and they also probably need to be hit.
Yeah, this is a good like general rule of thumb to follow. You can't just blindly apply this in all situations. For example, they have 13 funds, but they're at 10 points, and only 6 of those funds are trade postable immediately. And another faction is like at 22, and they're the despot, and they're going to claim all this sympathy if no one does anything. You still obviously have to consider the rest of the board and how winnable the game is for them. But as mentioned kind of earlier in this point, this kind of assumes the board is all equal. So in that specific scenario where the board is equal, if they've got 13 funds, that is a ridiculous amount of actions. And if there's lots of cardboard, if there's lots of crafting available, they can probably make use of those actions very effectively. But if the most of the craftables are gone, if there's not a lot of cardboard, if most of their ball's been wiped out, maybe even then that many funds is not enough to do enough with to win them the game. But you do really want to take into consideration the amount of funds they have. If the Otters are, oh my gosh, they're in the lead, but they've only got like 4 funds or 5 funds, what can they really do with that? Not a lot. You can't. That's 5 actions total over the course of your turn. Like you could move once, battle 3 times, move again, or like move once, battle once, craft something, and then move back. Like you realistically just don't have the action economy to compete with other factions in the late game. So use this as like a general rule, but don't follow it. Don't follow it blindly.
Yeah, certainly. And something that just came to me as you were going through those examples, Ellie, is you mentioned the Despot being at a large lead ahead of the Riverfolk. And I think another thing to consider with their number of funds is that trade posting actually will create more points for other players before it gets back to their turn. So they might actually be hesitant to drop a lot of trade posts right now because that could actually enable someone else's win. It's a similar problem that comes up with the Woodland Alliance, right? Where, yes, they could spread a lot of sympathy this turn and get in a position where they will win next turn, but because they're putting out so much cardboard, they're then enabling another faction to win the game that otherwise wouldn't have had a shot at it. I'm not sure exactly how frequently that would come up when making this calculation because a lot of times Otters like to drop a lot of trade posts on their final turn as opposed to their second to last turn. But it's just another thing to consider. And I guess something you could tell the Otters player if they're starting to drop several trade posts to maybe dissuade them from doing so. So moving on, there is another saying in the Root community. I don't hear this quite as often as 2 purchases gives the Otters the game, but it definitely is something that people talk about a lot, is that you should battle Otters for every purchase that you make. And the idea is that this balances out the advantage you just gave them with a purchase by removing some of their warriors from the board. But it's not quite a one-to-one exchange like that. You can't say every purchase made should equal 1 battle you do against the Otters. And the reason for that statement not being a rule of thumb is this. So the attacker deals 2 hits on an average roll in Root. On an average purchase, we'll give the Otters 0 to 1 surplus funds because on average you're buying for a price of either 2 or 3 funds. So just the simple math, the maybe 1 extra warrior we give them is just not going to balance out the 2 average hits they're taking from battles. And so I just wanted to address this really quick, and like everything else in this video, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to dealing with the Otters, and really in Root in general. But people like to say these things about Otters. I guess it's because they like have a quantifiable number of actions that they're being given by players that makes people want to come up with these numbers and ratios and relationships. But I just don't think that we can look at it in such a simple way.
Yeah, you definitely can't look at it in a super simple way. And while this may have sometimes been true in the past, where Otters were in an incredibly strong position where they were winning a lot of their games with not many purchases, nowadays you really can't treat this statement as a rule of thumb. The Otters are already struggling, and if they aren't being overfed, there's no reason to be hitting them. It really does come back to asking yourself, are they in a winning position? Does this purchase put them in a winning position? And if the answer is no, okay, then why am I hitting them? You don't, whenever someone, if someone at your table says, oh, okay, buy from the Otters, hit the Otters, that, easy, that's how you justify buying from them. You should only really be considering that if your buy is going to put them in a winning position, and if you are, like not in like last place, right? Because if I'm in last, I might need to buy and I don't have the capacity to hit them. Um, but if everyone's kind of competitive and equal, or maybe the Otters are behind, if buying them makes them equal, you don't suddenly just have to smack them to make them unequal again. You really do need to consider a lot of factors when you think about this statement.
And just a interesting thought to add on to that idea of unless the Otters are overfed, you don't need to hit them, is Garrick was discussing Garrick Samples Games, who runs the winter tournament and is an incredibly knowledgeable Root player. I trust his opinion on pretty much everything Root. He was in the theory discussion channel of the Woodland Warriors Discord discussing which is worse between the lizards and otters. And he was saying it's interesting because they're very comparable in the fact that they require, I believe he said, I can't quote it exactly, but an intense optimization of an engine that at its core is relying on RNG. If Garrick is saying that, what that tells me is the most important part for us is the intense optimization part, right? The otters need to play perfectly to have a chance at a win in games where they're being fed at a level that allows them to keep pace. So you hitting them is taking that puzzle that's already difficult and making it near impossible.
One of the things I like to say about Otters a lot is Otters are an efficiency game, and it's so easy to be inefficient with the Otters. At competitive tables where other players may be being more efficient, if you are being inefficient with the Otters, it can really cost you the game. They're a very fragile faction. Their warriors are hard to keep on the map. You really do want rule. You need people to buy from you to really give you a chance. You really do need to maximize every single turn. It's kind of like playing the Vagabond with Despot Infamy, where you just need to really plan out your turns very well and optimize as much as you can in order to give yourself a fighting chance. And if you don't do this, it can make the game very difficult. So when this is already the mindset you're in when you're trying to play as the Otters, if every time someone buys from you, they're smacking you, it makes it pretty much impossible to do anything because you're in a weak position to begin with. And if every time you get bought from, you get smacked, you're staying in a weak position. You're not getting any stronger.
In order to determine if we should battle the otters, now that we've determined that we shouldn't battle them for every purchase we make, we want to go back to that idea of calculating what position the otters are in, and then on top of that, what position your purchase will put the otters in. So if your purchase that you've just made puts them in a winning position, hit them. And we can use those guidelines that we just discussed as a way of getting us to that conclusion that they're in a winning position. Then you're going to want to take some warriors off the board, make it a little harder for them. But the otters can win without any warriors on the board. So if the purchase puts them in a winning position and they don't need any warriors on the board to close the game, just don't make that purchase to begin with.
So as I was mentioning earlier, it really does come down to how is my purchase going to benefit them. And one other thing I do want to note here that's pretty important is when you're buying from the Otters, you want to consider how they can trade post with your funds. So for example, if I'm the Cats, I'm all over the board. It's likely that the Otters are going to be able to trade post quite a bit with my funds. Let's say they have 3 funds now. If I buy from them again at 3, instead of being able to trade post only once with 3 funds, they can now trade post 3 times with the 6 funds. So you want to consider stuff like that when you're thinking about, what position do I put them in? How many trade posts can they drop with these funds? Do they already have a bunch of craftables in their hand and are they in the lead, or are they maybe close to being in the lead, you really want to consider, hey, if I buy from them and they are now in the lead, or they can now trade post a whole lot with my funds, this is probably the time that I should smack it to even it out. Whenever you're smacking the Otters, it should be to either knock them from the winning position into second or third place, or to just even out the table. You don't smack them just because you bought. You smack them to even out the table, to even out the advantage you gave them. If it's clear that advantage put them in a position where they could now win the game, or are very on track to winning it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that winning position doesn't come from just one or two purchases, as I hope we've made clear at this point. So now the hope at this point is that you, as the player, are better equipped to calculate what the Otter's position is, what position your purchase puts them in, and then on a more faction specific level that we can't really cover here, what that purchase does for you. And so, with all that in mind, we're heading into the tail end of this discussion, and I just wanted to quickly touch on early versus late purchases. So, the earlier the purchase is made, the better it is for the Otters. And the pre Marauder mindset was probably, we can assume, formed with early purchases in mind, right? That mindset being that two purchases will win the Otters the game. And this is because players needed to fix their hands prior to ad set. So those purchases that the Otters were getting were happening earlier in the game in order to offset bad RNG with their starting hand before they were drawing multiple cards in a given turn. So the reason that an early purchase is so good for the Otters is because each additional turn spent with a surplus fund is an additional action that the Otters are able to take. And since AdSet has reduced the need for early purchases, in general, I think we can safely say that players now have more leeway to purchase in the mid to late game. And that number of two purchases doesn't apply anymore. Just if you needed another reason to believe that way of thinking is antiquated, I think this is it.
Fundamentally, this does come down to the idea of what a surplus fund is and how it impacts the game, since players no longer need to even out their hand at the start of like every game when when they pick a faction or are given a faction. They don't need to buy. The Otters aren't getting a surplus fund they can use for the entire game, because you have the distinction of a normal fund and a surplus fund, but you also have the distinction of a surplus fund that I get on turn 0 or turn 2 versus a surplus fund I get on turn 6 or 7, where one of them can be used for literally the entire game or very close to it, and the other one can be used for like the last 2 turns. If they are getting consistent purchases on turn 0, 1, or 2, at that point you're saying, okay, well, those surplus funds are extremely valuable, and so maybe I don't purchase as much in the mid to late game. But if they just aren't being bought from as much in the early game, you, as a result, can purchase more from them in the mid to late game, because those surplus funds aren't benefiting them as much as they would if they were being bought from very early.
And I believe this is the last slide that we have. Yeah, so that just about wraps up our discussion on purchasing from the Otters. I do want to reiterate one more time. Elivaras also has a great Root YouTube channel. Please go watch his Otters video that he already put out and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss his upcoming comprehensive Otters strategy guide, which I am incredibly excited for. Elivaras, thank you so much for being the first guest on the channel. It was an absolute pleasure. Do you have any final thoughts on this topic before we close the video out?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Cole. It's been a huge pleasure to work on this video with you, and I certainly hope and believe we'll collaborate more in the future. One of the things I will say is Otters in general are a huge efficiency puzzle, and the way you approach them will highly vary from game to game because of things like what map it's played on, what factions are in the draft, what factions end up getting picked, what their card draw looks like from game to game. So, a lot of what we've talked about can be good, like overall things to think about, but they're not, the be all end all. For example, Cole mentioned at one point, pricing at 2 versus pricing at 3. And there are a lot of situations where those kind of decisions can change because of, what cards you have in your hand, the board state, if you think people are going to buy, if you highly value your cards. There's just so much variance in Otters play that it's really hard to have a very succinct and to the point discussion that enlightens the audience, because there's just so much variance that it's almost impossible to sum it up in a video like this. So we've done our best to kind of package things up in a way that makes sense and hopefully isn't information overload. But a lot of this, is going to come down to experience, and you'll get a better feel for it as you play more. Experiment in your games, figure out what happens if people buy 3 times versus 2 times. If you're playing with friends, maybe decide as a fun experiment, what happens if the Otters don't get any purchases but we don't hit them, or what happens if we just purchase as much as we want, or stuff like that. A lot of it is going to come down to experience, from experimenting. And so don't take what we say here as the be all end all, as, oh well, they said that and that's incorrect in this scenario, so discount everything else they say. Be very aware that things change, and the Otters in particular are one of the most difficult factions to play at a high level because of the insane amount of variance that comes with their games and the efficiency puzzle that comes with playing them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being on this video. Your Otter experience was invaluable. I definitely would not have been able to put all this together myself. I did just want to emphasize really quick, this is sort of unrelated to Otter gameplay specifically. When you're talking about experimenting with your games, this is something that I personally need to get better with, and I think it's worth just putting a spotlight on. If you're someone who wants to play Root at a high level, and maybe you aspire to play in tournaments and go far in tournaments, maybe you already have played in tournaments, I don't know. If you want to know the most possible about Root in those high pressure tournament situations, then treat your other games as experiments, like Ellie said, right? I know you want to win. I want to win. We all want to win. But maybe don't stick to that same strategy that you always employ with a given faction. Maybe test the limits of what that faction's capable of, test the limits of what that strategy does to the rest of the board and how the other players respond to it, because that's giving you more information. And the more information you have going into a game that actually has real stakes, the better equipped you will be to win it. And I think that's just something worth thinking about.
Yep, all great points. The reality is, if you think you found the winning solution for a game, and you approach every game from that mindset, that can hold you back as a player. And really understanding um, the benefits and risks of certain situations can be a huge benefit to you. If you just don't know and you're worried about how this might impact the table, and you decide not to because you're worried about it, but maybe it ends up actually being fine if you did do that, you'll only find that out if you actually take that risk. Don't treat this is something I've fallen victim to sometimes, and I'm sure every Root player that is maybe slightly competitive, at the very least slightly competitive, has fallen into, where you get this attachment to the idea of winning every game and doing your best to win every game, that you avoid taking risks because it might hurt your chances to win the game. But the reality is, if you get really into this game, you're gonna play hundreds of games. You're probably not gonna remember game number 7 when you're at game number 81. So, prioritize getting some of that experiments, trying things out, and don't necessarily play to win in every single. Well, I mean, obviously play to win, but don't play to win to the extent where you decline to take risks because you're super fixated on getting that win.
Yeah. All right. Well, this was a great discussion, and it did run on for a bit longer than I anticipated. Ellie, I know you are busy. You don't have all the time in the world. So thank you, the viewer, for watching. And thank you one more time, Ellie, for coming on. And I will see you all in the next video.